Whakaroa o te wā ka perua taku titiro whakamuri. Ki ngā uki ngā. He kāre wāruku tai mahara. He kāre wāruku tai naia. Ka uki mai ki au nai. Whakakao nei au. He tā whao mo taku ahi. He ahi whakamahara, he ahi whakamahana. No mai ko ta maruru, oine koukou o te pō te a. Ei, katau taku manu e katau.
I was home birthed in Whatatutu on the 7th of August 1940. My name was Urikore, but Nanipa made a spelling mistake when I was registered, so on my birth certificate it says Urikore. The E makes an important difference. E hika. What was he thinking? My early life was spent at Tahu, Mangatahu, sheep station, inland at Mangatu in the Gisborne region. Mangatu was incorporated Māori land, big sheep farm country with several stations. Nanipa had Tahu at the time. I think I might have been the last of my siblings to be born at home. I am the sixth child in a family of 15, between a spate of girls. This was a time when boys were important as farmhands. It was also wartime. I think working away from home, isolation, having more children, and treacherously narrow dirt roads drove our father to resettle the family at Pakowhai Pa. The pa was importantly closer to whānau and also to town. I was brought up at Pakowhai Pa at the ages of 5 to 8.
Growing up with Paperi was real simple, back to basics. Taught me how to drive manual, taught me how to garden, cook, patties, just real, it was real simple, life was real simple.
Yeah, we used to wake up early and he used to always be drawing pictures, writing in his diary. Always had a diary, and we used to always have the TV going. Like I remember I couldn't go sleep, like when I used to come back for the weekend, I couldn't sleep without like white noise type of thing, like cause I always go to sleep with the TV on, and then when I wake up the TV goes straight on, so it's like, it was weird being in like a quiet, like there's not a TV. So that was a buzzy one.
I think it goes back to that last thing I said about who he was as a man of faith. I think what I always saw, and later on, more so now as an adult, how I saw him every morning. He'd turn everything on, turn the radio on, turn the TV on, and while he did that, he was always writing his word of the day down, or whatever happened the day before.
My heart will always belong to Ringatu. When I think back, we never really talked about our faith growing up. I just believed. So from a very young age, I have always had a reverence for God and a belief that God is everywhere, especially in nature. Different pastimes at the pa, we played and worked. Once in a while, a pram would come up to the pa washed up from the river. The pram was quickly stripped. Number 8 gauge wire served as both handle support at one end, while the other was fed through the center of the wheel. Wheels of the pram were converted into toy trucks and cars.
And then he had a whole nother funny side where he would do random things, and he would make things out of nothing. So he would make a torch out of the headlight, like what Ngāriki told about when we went floundering, and you'd use a car battery, push out the headlight, and then get all these wires and connect them up. So I think lessons for me was about creativity, about learning.
Sometimes all the kids used to go eeling together. The older ones would take them so far up the river, then tell them to go back and say, "You're too little, you go home." There would be one guard that would stay there to make sure none of us followed the older boys.
And so I think in terms of learning, he always created a stepping stone without saying to you, it's a stepping stone for you to get to. You just watch learning, he'll just give you a nod to say, oh yeah, you stay over there, and you knew that there was a safety barrier there. And then he had...
In those days, we sort of read everyone's mind. Not many still do that nowadays. It's sort of like you sit at the table and you butter a bread, but it's for someone else, and before you ask for the salt, you've already been given it. And someone else is buttering your bread at the same time. We buttered each other's bread.
The experiences I have with Papa, I had many experiences with Papa. There's too many to tell, but most of them were around kai and him showing up at the best times, whether it was at school, whether it was at home, whatever it was, he always showed up at the best perfect time, most perfect time, and he always, and the other experiences were around other taiao, so whether that was going diving, all of that stuff. So those were some of the main experiences I had with him, but most importantly, the experiences I had with him were around who he was and his faith.
So when it was time for eeling, it was the same. We read each other's mind. One person would start making the hook, and the older boys would follow making the hooks. You didn't have to be told. You knew something was happening. It was exciting. Next minute, you start to make your own hook. Then the next day, everyone would be eeling without talking about it. We weren't entertained with stories about our maunga, our awa, our whenua, or about our tupuna, like this generation. We just lived it.
Not a take person, he's a giving person. And if he will take, he'll give you 10 times more, you know, so
for the next couple of years.
Yeah. So you do one generous thing for him, and you'll get food and muscles and anything at your doorstep for the next lifetime.
The next gone.
Yeah, to the next you don't like them anymore.
Giving, he was always giving. He was always doing something of service, whether that was dropping things off, dropping kai off, dropping some koha off, dropping resources, whatever he thought people needed, even if people didn't need it. I always saw him finding ways to keep connected with people. We would always go with him to people's places, and he would always drop something off, like bread, pippies, all of those things, kanas, fizzy drinks, custard, lollies, and he would drop a lazy 20 off or a few coins to the kids, and tried to be clear about the fact that he wasn't perfect, but for us he really was. He was like a superhero and stuff like that, and none of us can really replace that, but it is something to look up to, someone who did simple things that actually made people's almost lives, so including our own.
The old people learned to listen out for the first karanga call of the first shining kuku pipi whareroa. The old women would begin to weave the kete with the bigger hoes to gather the seeds for the pataka. The men would be tilling the soil in preparation for the planting out of potatoes, corn, kamo, pumpkin, watermelon, and sugarcane. When the second karanga of the shiny cuckoo came, it was time for harvest. When the kuia heard the call, they would get excited, jump up and start singing. So we did not escape having to drag those kete along the 3 rows, grading, sorting and stacking the rewai. potato. The large ones for the pa, small ones for each whānau, and the medium ones for the following next season.
The idea of whakaiti, humility, is he wasn't a boisterous or out there or outspoken person. He was quite humble, and he led with humility. So, and he led with action. He didn't let his words do much. He just showed us everything. Everything was done by showing us. So a man of action and always gave to people. Papa wasn't flash, but he gave everything to us. He didn't have the flashes, anything, but he gave everything that he had to all of us. So, you know, when I think about Papa, I think he was selfless in terms of, you know, always put us first. The idea.
The whānau moved away from Pakowhai Pa to Tātaka Valley, across from the Mangatu River, the vicinity of the Urikore stream that we called the Kokomo. And that was the papakanga for our whānau. We stayed at Omapere with Nani Pupaku and Nani Lovey in them until our home was built. It was a small house with 2 doors, a living area and a kitchen. One memory of those days is Nani Ma's tea. I am always trying to recreate the kinds of cups of teas Nani Ma used to make with cow's milk back home. I recall that I left school in Standard 5 at age 10 or 11. I had 3 weeks of high school at some point, but to my mind I left in Standard 5. When I was 8 years old, I remember driving big tractors, helping on the farm, milking and tending to the cows. I went shearing and was the second cook for Steve Wainui's shearing gang. His wife, Sarah Brown, taught me how to brawn, and old Pop Wainui taught me how to make my own blood pudding. I used to go back and forth between here and home. The old man used to borrow us out when the cows dried up. As second cook, I had a job of lighting the fire when the shepherds were working. They used to send me ahead to light the fire when I had lit it. I used to prefer to sit out in the paddock to wait for the men to come home because the kehua inside the shepherd's quarters, that was up at Riki. Must be at the end of the season, I went back to Torere and lived with Emma Hoya. She was also a part of Steve Wainui's gang. I eventually came back to Gisborne and worked at Waddy's for about a week, just long enough to make 2 new friends, Ross Kay and Monty Westrip, and long enough to buy a plane ticket to follow them back to Motueka in Nelson. In Motueka, I had a job of picking hops or tobacco leaves.
He's a very spontaneous person. Pull up whenever, leave whenever, you know, go on trips whenever. He would pick me up from school like all the time. We get in the car, still got my school uniform on. This was back when we were at Hillary. And then suddenly we we drive past Kokiri, we drive past there, then we're driving out of Ota, then we're on the motorway, and suddenly we're in Gisborne. So it's like, who would have thought? I would go to school that day and come back and go to Gisborne. Yeah. So yeah, very spontaneous.
Then I joined the Bullens Circus that had a tour around New Zealand from Christchurch to Lyven. They had a Wild West Cowboys and Indians show where the cowboys saved the damsel in distress by the Indians that tied her up to the post. I played one of the Indians who rode around and around the arena, who gets shot and rolls off his horse, dead. Anyways, after that, I caught a train all the way back to Auckland. Homeless and penniless, Walker and Turner. All my troubles began when I got to Auckland. I was homeless and penniless. I think I was probably one of the first street kids in Auckland. I slept on planks under a boardwalk for 3 or 4 weeks. I wasn't the only one. That's where I met Joe Shortland and some of the other fellows.
Taking things too seriously and times get bad. Not to stress too much about it. and find joy and find joy in everything, whether it's good or bad.
We didn't stick together during the day. We sort of went our own ways. What we found was that the police would target us if we were together. Once a policeman asked me where I worked, and I told him Walkers and Turners. Thinking to myself, I walked the streets and turned the corners. I got that talking from living under the boardwalk.
I always saw him finding ways to keep connected with people, or just maintaining relationships that way. And so
would do things in the community in Otara all the way to Gisborne to up north. People knew him, people knew him.
I walked around and eventually found a job for £8 per week and had lodgings in Wellington Street, Ponsonby. That was £4 a week. I washed at public showers where the Victoria Market is now. People from all walks of life met there every evening for showers. It had a community atmosphere. In Auckland, I also discovered the trade hall, rock and roll, and Elvis. We worked all over the place, and Joe took me up to Motato to stay with his family, Dick and Mate. Work was everywhere, and it was easy to work with my farming experience. I got paid.
After this project, I realized that I saw my papa differently. The story ends at the age that I am right now, 17, and just I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be him and being independent and working all over the place at such a young age, and also learned that all the stories that me and my siblings talked about could never fully tell my papa's story because it's so great, especially in our eyes. But it also does something great, like it does something, it brings life into this world. It brings him back to life. And to us, that is a very special thing. But and that's about it.